Hi, everyone. Welcome to the APDA Beyond Medication Wellness series. This month, we are tackling freezing of gait with our 4-week series called Beat the Freeze. And this is week 2. So, welcome back. My name is Jennie Alex, and I am a physical therapist who works at the Parkinson's Fitness Project in Seattle, Washington. We have in-person clinics in Seattle, and then we also have a virtual exercise platform called Daily Dose PD that's accessible anywhere. Here is a picture of our team from an APDA walk a few years ago. So, what are our goals for week 2? So, we want to do a quick review of last session, and then we're going to expand upon that. So, we want to discuss the use of cueing strategies that can be used to optimize walking and manage freezing episodes. We're also going to discuss some emerging technology that's being developed to address freezing of gait. I'm going to be talking about a number of different products today, and I want you to know that we have no financial affiliation for any of the devices that we discuss today. So, a review from week 1. Why does freezing of gait occur in Parkinson's? Freezing of gait occurs because Parkinson's causes your walking to be less automatic. So, with the loss of dopamine, dopamine is involved in a pathway of the brain that controls subconscious movement. So, let's say I were to get up and walk through a doorway and turn and sit in a chair. I wouldn't be thinking about how I'm shifting my weight and how high and how far I'm picking up my steps. That sort of rhythm of my walking is typically controlled subconsciously. So in Parkinson's, that subconscious movement pattern can be disrupted. So common places where freezing shows up, turning, and also initiating walking. So when you first get up, taking the first few steps. Those are common scenarios in which someone can freeze. Again, because the walking is less automatic, it can be hard to do two things at once. So if I'm having to more consciously pick up my feet, the second my attention, as in this picture, shifts to the cell phone, I lose that rhythm, I lose that timing, and then that can cause me to freeze. So multitasking is a trigger for freezing of gait. There's a visual spatial trigger. Freezing is more common indoors and crowded spaces. And then or freezing is more common in stressful situations. So crossing that busy crosswalk that's pictured, or trying to get into that crowded elevator. When there's that emotional component, that stress, it can also cause a freezing episode. So we talked last week about some beat the freeze steps. So this picture shows the common posture that someone gets into when they freeze. So he's trying to walk across the room. Let's say the doorbell rings, his dog starts barking, and he gets stuck. So you can see he starts, his brain still wants to walk across the room, but he's gotten stuck in his feet. And this posture, being your center of mass starts to lean in front of your base of support, and it puts you at risk for falling. So the first step to beat the freeze is to stop what you're doing and get your weight shifted back into your heels. If you keep going, you're going to sort of be in this controlled fall forward in your toes. So you really have to pause. And I said that's one of the challenges of beat the freeze, is a lot of times it's causing you to have to move from point A to point B a little bit slower, but ultimately a lot safer, and then avoiding those freezing episodes. So stop, get weight back into your heels, and get back up tall. Now we're going to start to shift the weight side to side, getting the feet a little bit further apart. Often when someone freezes, their feet are really close together and it's really hard to weight shift. So rocking back and forth, getting the feet further apart, unglue the feet from the floor, and then try and take a big step. We talked about using beat the freeze reactively. So you're stuck walking through a doorway. You can talk yourself through these steps. But we also talked about using beat the freeze proactively. So you're getting ready to walk through the doorway of a crowded doctor's office. You're going to, as you approach the doorway, start to get your feet a little bit wider. And instead of just worrying about walking forward, you're actually going to do that weight shift a little bit exaggerated. And you're going to use that to get through the doorway proactively to hopefully avoid freezing. Now, if you've tried out some of these strategies this past week and you haven't had luck, don't fret. Freezing of gait is a complicated issue. If it was as simple as a few weight shifts and it all went away, it wouldn't be a problem for people, and there would be no reason to do a 4-part series on it. So, week by week, we're going to talk about how we add more and more complexity to the training to help these techniques carry over and be applicable in real world situations. So, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about weight shifting because weight shifting is just so foundational to everything else we add. So, you practice that sort of weight shift in place that we talked about. Now, we're going to start training with more cueing and targets. So, what we're going to talk about first today is how to use cueing to get a bigger weight shift. We want to recalibrate your brain's perception of movement. So this is using weight shifting during a turn. So he has a visual cue, he's turning to the lights. He also has the cue of the hula hoop to try and get his feet a little bit wider. And so we're trying to use some things in the environment to enhance his practice with weight shifting. So that was turn training. Now we're going to look at sort of a montage of a client going through a bunch of different freezing exercises. So he's going to start with where we left off last week, just some of that big weight shifting in place. And we're going to go back. He's really transferring his weight from foot to foot, unweighting that trailing foot, getting it unstuck. Now we're going to do 2 activities that involved a shift and then a step. Shift, step, shift, step. And now we're going to use that weight shifting proactively. So he was having issues freezing in this hallway. It's more crowded than in the open gyms, in the open gym space where he was training. So he's proactively getting his feet wider apart. He's going to weight shift in place because he was also having some freezing when he would start to walk. So instead of freezing and then reacting, he's going to use beat the freeze to initiate walking. He's going to get the feet unstuck from the floor. Then he's going to take a big step and he's going to keep that weight shifting going as he walks down the hallway. We also talked about last week that we work on weight shifting in all different positions. So again, how can we use targets? Instead of just shifting your weight in place, can we have you reach for something to get to experience a nice big weight shift? Again, it takes lots of practice in all these different positions to really feel what that weight shift should feel like. So this is going to be an example of weight shifting on hands and knees with a crawling exercise. So he's having to shift his weight from knee to knee. And then he's also getting an added weight shift, reaching for those blaze pods. He has to tap it out to get the next one to turn on. This is going to be an example of weight shifting lying on your back. So he's having to shift his weight side to side, get that hoop up and over the stick. And it's just more effective with a target versus if I just told him to rock side to side with the hoop. Having to reach for that target makes that weight shift even bigger. And then finally, weight shifting in kneeling. And what he's focused on is he's transferring these colored targets up on top of this foam roll. He's just trying to accomplish the task, but the task is forcing him to weight shift. Okay, so lots of weight shifting practice with targets. Another way we can expand on some of that weight shifting practice is adding music, adding a beat or a rhythm to train to synchronize your weight shifting too. So this one I actually am going to keep sound on. This is from one of our daily dose drumming classes. So trying to get that timing of the weight shift back by having that music in the background. So we've been training weight shifting. How do we start to apply it to freezing of gait? So like we said, we can have you just walk back and forth across the room. But how do we put you in a little bit more stressful of a situation? And so, like I said, weeks 3 and 4 are going to be talking even more about this. But I did want to touch on the treadmill because I do think it's just so important. So, why I think the treadmill is beneficial for freezing of gait is if you're walking over ground and have a little stutter step through your toes, um, it can be very inconsequential for a lot of people, but if that little stutter step, if we can pull that out on the treadmill, um, we can sort of, there's more of a loss of balance associated with it, and so we can start to train using weight shifting on the treadmill. Sometimes I have people walk in the clinic, turn, sit down. I don't see any freezing, but when I get them on the belt and they're having to keep up with that moving belt, they can be actually quite unsteady, something that they aren't experiencing over the ground. It's almost like the treadmill pulls out some of that freezing of gait. So this is a gentleman who he's 91 years old. Freezing of the gait was a big symptom for him. And so our treadmills have this harness system on them so that if he would get his foot caught and have a fall, we would not lose him off the back of the treadmill. And unfortunately, I don't have a good before video because he was just so unsafe on the treadmill. So thinking of that picture from the beginning, I would get him on the treadmill and he would just be really stuck forward on his toes on the treadmill. So you're going to see we did a lot of weight shifting practice. We did a lot of practice with cueing that we're going to talk about for the remainder of today. And then we sort of put it into play up here on the treadmill. So like I said, when he first got on the treadmill, I mean, he could walk for maybe 10 or 20 seconds just forward before he would freeze. So not only is he walking forward, he's not holding on, but we're practicing turns on the treadmill, because turns on the ground were a place where he's going to freeze. In week one, we talked about managing expectations, really having you understand why you're freezing, practice freezing recovery. Unfortunately, I've never worked with someone who I make their freezing go away completely, but you're going to watch here when he turns to the other side, that freezing is going to come out for a bit, but he's able to pretty quickly pull himself out of it. So there's that little stutter step, but he pulls out of it and recovers. And I'm just sort of shouting directions at him. He doesn't really know where I'm going to tell him to turn. It's more unpredictable. There was another little quick freeze, but he pulls out of it, and he doesn't lose his balance. So how did he get to this point of being able to do this on the treadmill? Well, there were weeks and weeks of practice with cueing strategies. Another thing that we utilized with him is him just visualizing big successful movements. So there's an interesting phenomenon. I just wanted to introduce it here because I wanted you to realize that just by watching these videos and attending this presentation today, you are actually engaging in some meaningful therapy for yourself. So there has been research that observing others performing a motor task, so action observation, or imagining yourself performing that task, it can enhance outcomes. So I would have him watch me walk on the treadmill with a nice big weight shift. I would also have him imagine himself walking on the treadmill. So, like during the rest breaks, instead of just sitting there, we would put in some of this action, observation, and motor imagery into play. And what's really interesting about this is we have these mirror neurons in our brain. So research has shown that when he, when you watch someone performing the actions, it turns on some of the same neurons that turn on when you're actually performing the action. So again, just like a little interesting tidbit to throw in here as we talk about all of these cueing strategies, imagining yourself successful with these strategies, rehearsing those places in your house where you freeze mentally, is beneficial as well as practicing it physically. So cueing, you saw in those videos of weight shifting how adding a target, adding a rhythm, it enhanced the performance of the weight shift. So we're going to spend the remainder of today talking about kind of expanding upon the use of cueing strategies. So there's three main categories that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about visual cues, we're going to talk about auditory cues, and we're going to talk about somatosensory cues. So, tactile, something you can feel as a cue. Cueing really, it helps to recruit other areas of the brain to bypass that faulty motor circuit. So that subconscious rhythm timing isn't there. So can we bring attention to the movement by having you step over a line? Can we redirect attention and get you to pick up your foot? If you can't sort of just subconsciously sequence it, when you have that attention to actually picking your foot up over a line, often you can be a lot more successful. So that's sort of improving amplitude of the step. And then training with a rhythm, like we saw in that drumming class, that can improve just sort of your sequencing timing of a weight shift. So we're going to start with visual cues. A very low tech visual cue is just lines on the floor. So I'm going to go forward and then come back to this slide. So we're going to watch the power of visual cues in action. So this is going to show a gentleman, and there's a there's a change in the surface, and you can see how that causes him to get stuck in his toes. So I'm going to fast forward this video here. And then we're going to see what happens with these lines on the floor. So you can see just moments later, just by those lines being on the floor, he's much more successful at that task. So sometimes we actually, I use lines in someone's house. So let's say there's a doorway, there's a turn in their bathroom, a tight space in their kitchen. A low tech solution to address freezing is sometimes actually taping out some lines on your floor. We're going to talk about lasers. So the gentleman you saw on the treadmill, one way I got him to start picking up his feet on the treadmill was I had a little device that projected a laser down on the belt of the treadmill. So he had to actually step over that line, and he was able to pick his feet up a lot more successfully. And then eventually, we had to fade away that cue and have him still maintain stepping without the laser. We also train stepping over. So stepping over an actual target or an obstacle. Again, that's using a different part of your brain. It's more conscious, you picking your foot up over a hurdle. So that is actually going to be our next video. So we use lots and lots of hurdles when we work on different freezing of gait activities. So you're going to watch as this person approaches the hurdle. You'll see their feet are pretty narrow. They're kind of taking some shuffling steps to get lined up to the hurdle. And then they're going to get cued to get their feet further apart. And again, much like that other video, they're going to practice that weight shift in place and then start taking the big steps over the hurdle. So we can also use visual cues. I'll make this bigger. So we can use it for walking, in a straight path across the room, but we can also use a visual cue to help with a turn step. So he has that cue having to move his foot into that other target. He was getting stuck. Turning was a big trigger for him. So he's going to have to pick up his foot over to that target, and that's going to reinforce a nice big turn step. He also is going to have an additional weight shift reaching to hit that whacker into the punching bag. And so this video is a little bit of a preview for what the layers that Nate's going to build to this in week 3 and 4. You can see, so he's having to shift his weight, he's having to reach and hit the punching bag, and then he also has a little sequence that he's having to replicate. So again, layer upon layer. We start with the weight shift in place. We add a cue, or a target to get that weight shift bigger. We start to use that cue in a situation in which you're freezing, but then we have to make it even more complex. So we can fade that cue away, or we can give you sort of a cognitive task on top of it. So like I said, ultimately our goal for someone would be to do a lot of training with lines or hurdles, you know, taping lines like through the doorway of the clinic and making them practice over and over again with those lines as the cue, and then fade it away and have them repeat that movement. They've done enough practice that they know what it feels like, and they can replicate stepping through that doorway without that actual physical line. You can So if that's not working, sometimes you can cue someone to imagine the line on the ground. So like imagine as you walk through the doorway, you're stepping over the hurdles. Um, that's sort of mixed in how effective that can be. But if that visual cue is really effective for somebody and we can't wean it off, then we start to think about maybe using some more equipment that they can take with them. Obviously, I can't follow them around with a roll of painter's tape. So there are some devices on the market that are specifically have been developed to tackle this issue. So this is sort of the use of lasers. This walker on the left is called a U-step walker. It's a sturdy walker. It's designed to be really stable to prevent falls, but also have a really tight turning radius. And then it also has a component on it where you can turn on a laser light. So there's actually that laser on the floor for you to step over. The other device on this page is called a neck stride. And so what this is it's again, it's a component that puts that laser light on the floor. You can see his is green, but this component can be attached to any assistive device. So you can put it on a walker you already have, you can put it on a cane, or in this case, he's actually put it on his trekking pole. So I'm going to pull up a video of the neck stride in use because I think it can be helpful to try and visualize how it's used. I'm going to click through this and I want to actually go to the demo. Okay. So she has that little neck stride on her cane. She's turned it on. So she has that green laser light. And so if you're having trouble initiating walking, that line gives you something to step towards. And then you'll see she'll keep it on and she's going to step towards that line all the way through the turn. So as she advances that cane, she keeps that visual cue moving. So I would say two drawbacks to these. Number one, it does cause you to have to look down at the ground, which isn't great for posture. And they're both expensive. But for the right person, they can be really effective. The laser can be hard to see out in the daylight. So I do find it most useful in indoor spaces. But, depending on the lighting, I have had people use it, for certain street crossings outside. Another sort of more emerging technology is if these visual cues are really effective for someone and we can't wean them away, could there be some sort of augmented reality technology? So this is the idea of like a Google Glass or some sort of lens that you wear that then displays on the ground. So you're walking through your living room and through the augmented reality lenses, you have this pathway of lines displayed that you can step over. Okay, so that was visual cueing. We're going to move on and we're going to talk about rhythmic auditory cueing. So like we said, the weight shifts aren't big enough, and they're often even a little too quick. It turns into this quick little stutter step, not this big, smooth weight shift. So we saw in the drumming class that moving along with that rhythm was getting better timing of the weight shift. So these are devices that we can use um, to help tackle a scenario where someone's freezing. So one is a metronome. There's tons of free metronome apps online, and you can, going back to that scenario of stepping through the doorway at the doctor's office, we could practice that with someone. They're synchronizing their steps to the beat of a metronome. Again, that gentleman on the treadmill, that was something we used with him when he was starting. I would have a beat of a metronome playing, especially during those side steps, getting him to pick up his feet along with the beat of the metronome. Now, it's tough to tell you what beats per minute. I had someone yesterday, and depending on the activity, like we were doing one thing, I had it at 40 beats per minute. Then we increased it to 60. So I will say, working one on one with a physical therapist to help you kind of problem solve what beats per minute is most helpful to you is something that I would recommend. So it can be that beat of a metronome, but it can also be music with a really good beat. A lot of exercise classes, we make people move along with a rhythm. One thing I tell people is if you're riding on a stationary bike or walking on a treadmill already, doing it with up tempo and music in the background is a great, easy way to sort of enhance something that you're already doing. So you probably, if we want to train you to walk into that doctor's office, one thing we might do is train you walking through that door over and over with the beat of a metronome. And then maybe what we'll do is take that external cue of the metronome away and make you count out a beat. So like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So that's going to bring a lot of attention to your weight shift, and you're sort of saying that in your head, really trying to get yourself sequenced, walking through a space where you typically freeze. Humming a song, some people are just their brains are very musically inclined. My grandfather was one of those people. He was just always very musical, and he had Parkinson's, and when walking became more difficult, he would actually strap a boombox to his rollator, and as he was walking around his independent living facility, when he had that boombox playing music, he felt that he was able to pick his feet up and move through that space much more efficiently. So we're going to go back to that video that we watched previously. So we're going to review how he freezes, and then we're going to play it for a little longer this time because I want you to watch how he gets stuck on that turn. So we're getting frustrating. That turn used to be automatic. He used to be able to walk and turn and not think about it. So here's him walking with the lines. But now here's the metronome. And I want you to pay attention to how much the metronome beat is going to help him on the turn. He's going to sync up to that beat with his weight shifts. And then his turn is much more successful. So, our first step, like I said, would be to do lots and lots and lots of practice with that auditory cue, sort of retrain an internal sense of rhythm. and then wean it away. If we find that it's hard to do it without the actual cue, both of those two devices I talked about previously have a metronome option. So both the U step and the next stride have a laser line and a metronome. So you can use them both. You can use one at certain times. So they have both of those cueing strategies built in. Okay, so we're going to move on to the third cueing strategy, which is somatosensory. So this is tactile, something that you can feel, oftentimes through the form of vibration. So there's tons of equipment that's looking at this, and I actually think this is a super promising avenue to address freezing of gait. So there's sensors and shoes and socks. Preparing for this talk, I realized I could give a whole lecture just on vibrotactile cueing devices. There's belts and wristbands. Vibration is in the news a lot through different gloves that they're using to address tremor. So lots of talk about vibration. I'm going to highlight a few today. So on the bottom is a device called the Q1. This is a little sensor that you actually wear on your sternum. Now, let me start off by saying that this is not available in the US, but there are trials underway, and hopefully it could get FDA approval. But the idea is this: they found through different testing that the sternum was a particularly successful place to give the cue. So instead of having the rhythmic auditory stimulation, it would have a rhythmic vibration stimulation. So a little less conspicuous, if you're trying to walk through a doorway, instead of having a metronome app going in your pocket, you could have this little vibration happening through the Q1. Another piece of equipment is a new shoe. And so, like I said, we as a clinic have no financial gain from new shoe, but we have actually recently partnered with them and have obtained a few of these shoes to use with patients in the clinic. And we just received them a few weeks ago, but we're excited to try them out. So what these shoes are, they're two things. So they have a certain level of biofeedback. So there's a lot of sensors in the shoe, and they collect data on a number of gait parameters. So you can put the shoes on and measure how fast someone's walking, how long their steps are, how symmetrical they are one side versus the other, the angle at which their foot is hitting the ground. And then you can track how those gait parameters are changing over time, or sometimes sort of within a session. We'll analyze their gait, we'll do a bunch of treatment, and then we'll retest it to see if we've made progress. So it's one thing to have that, just watching that they're walking is looking better, but it can be nice to have some actual data. And then beyond that, there's actually this vibrotactile biofeedback in the sole. So the sole of the shoe vibrates. The shoe can detect when your foot leaves the ground, and it provides vibration that then turns off when you take a step. I should say, you can actually select to deliver the vibration in a lot of different ways, but that's the setting that we found to be most effective for freezing of gait. And then the cue that we give patients is to keep the vibration on as long as possible. So I'm going to show you a video of these shoes in action. While I get this video up and running, I'm going to say, so not every cueing strategy works for every patient. But what I will say is that when a cueing strategy is effective, it can be, every bit as dramatic. Like, I guess what I should say is this video isn't making it more dramatic. Like, we've had patients where they put on the shoe and the change is this quick. And then we've had other patients that they don't really seem to work for. Okay, so this is going to show, this is actually, this video is taken at World Parkinson Congress a few years ago. So he's going to be trying to walk through this little narrow space next to the banner. And I'm going to pause it right here because this is sort of a perfect replica of that picture that I showed at the beginning of the talk. So, he's trying to get through the banner. He's stuck on his toes. His feet won't move, and now he's at risk for falling forward. So first, what I like about this video is it's going to show him using some of the beat the freeze steps to prevent a fall. So he's going to stop, get his weight back on his heels. Now he's going to try to shift his weight. Unfortunately, I think it's just too complex of an environment. His feet are too close together. He just sort of keeps stopping, restarting. You're going to see him sigh. He's trying to relax. And so now they're going to turn the shoes on. And again, so when he picks up his foot, the shoe detects it, turns the vibration on. He's trying to keep that vibration on for longer. And it's going to turn off when he puts his foot down. And so pretty amazing, like him just having that feedback, he's able to pick up his feet. So, like I said, I think this is a super promising technology. I think the drawback is, as with a lot of this technology, the shoes are $1,200, which isn't doable for most people. So we're sort of playing around in the clinic. Is this something that we could use as a training device in the clinic? What's sort of the carryover effect? Can we use it and then wean people off of it? Or if it's something that they really need all the time, what are potential funding resources for them? Could down the road there be some sort of insurance approval? Um, to be continued on that. So I think the idea of sort of combining cueing with some sort of wearable sensor, like I said, there's tons of things looking at this combination and really looking at sensors that could detect freezing of gait in real time and then deliver a cue or stimulation to recover from that episode more quickly. So, the idea is that maybe the shoe, it detects when your feet are getting stuck, delivers that vibration, is able to sort of respond a little bit more dynamically to help people with freezing episodes. So again, there's lots of things being studied on the market with wearable sensors, and hopefully down the road, some of this is more commercially available. Building off of that, something that is not is close to being utilized in patients is a similar idea. So it's a closed loop DBS or an adaptive DBS. So deep brain stimulation, they've developed technology in which there's a sensor, and interestingly, when someone freezes, there's actual changes in brain waves. And these closed loop DBS systems can detect that change in brain waves, know that the person is freezing, and then it can change the stimulation that the DBS is giving to pull someone out of a freezing of gait episode. So again, sort of this on-demand stimulation or cue to help somebody more quickly get unstuck. So effectiveness of cueing strategies for freezing of gait. I think, I had people submit some questions on this topic. And I think the most common question I got was someone who sort of wrote this paragraph of a scenario in which they were freezing, and they wanted to know which cueing strategy I would recommend they would use. And that's really hard when you aren't working with someone face to face. So I really encourage you, if freezing is something that you're struggling with, I really encourage you to seek out a Parkinson's specialized physical therapist. I will give you my contact information on the last slide. So if you aren't in the Seattle area, I can point you in the direction of how to potentially find that. But it does take a lot of practice. Like that gentleman on the treadmill, um, it took some practice figuring out visual cues for him were a bit more effective than auditory cues. And so we had to play around, and then lots of practice with that cue in different scenarios, one on one. It was hard to just come up with a cue and then have him go home and instantly implement it at home. It took lots of practice to make that cueing effective. And so we talked about today the difference. So I kind of want to review the difference between an internal cue or an external cue. So an internal cue is something that, like, I'm telling myself, I'm having to remind myself, am I counting? Am I humming a song? Am I just telling myself, stop, shift my weight? That all takes some, that's a cognitive load, having to use that internal cue. It can be difficult to remember to use it effectively. So, things we can do, I mean, lots and lots of practice, training caregivers or loved ones to provide a cue. And then, like I said, in weeks 3 and 4, what are some ways that we add layers to this training to help those internal cues carry over? So external cues are different. It's something in the environment. There's a line on the floor, and just by the nature of the line being there, my brain is able to reroute, pick up my foot. A metronome, a vibration that's being applied to my body. These are very effective in the moment, but carryover is tricky when the cues are removed. So we do lots of practice with the cue, and then try to fade it over time. Like I said, lots of stepping with an actual line. Well, lots of weight shifting, just feeling a weight shift, combining that weight shift with an actual line, and then trying to fade that cue away and have the person still replicate the movement. If a cue is really essential, we can consider use of some of that equipment that we talked about, but unfortunately, with some of the more complex technology, that may be cost prohibitive. And I think I think the most important piece is going to be taking what we learned weeks 1 and 2, and then, like I said, adding cognition on top of it. So Nate's going to really talk about, okay, let's take a real world scenario, and add enough layers of complexity. Walking over some lines in a very sterile gym space, your walking could look beautiful. It's really hard to get that to carry over to a busy grocery store. And so Nate's going to talk about that piece of how do we get that carryover. So here's our contact information. Like I said, in-person clinics in Seattle, we offer insurance-based physical therapy. We also offer private pay, personal training. We call it neurofitness. And then we have our virtual platform, Daily Dose. We have lots of classes on there that address some of the components that we've talked about. The drumming class you saw a sneak peek of. I think every Parkinson's exercise class out there probably involves some weight shifting practice. And then here's my contact information. Email is probably the best way to reach me. I'm going to address a few questions that I received already, but then if there's something that I didn't touch upon, don't hesitate to reach out. So I touched on cost briefly with the shoes. Those new shoes are $1,200. Like I said, unfortunately, a lot of those queuing strategies are expensive. So the U step walker with that queuing component, I think it's about $900, everything combined. Now, that being said, if I'm recommending that for somebody, I do encourage them to reach out to the company you step. There is some Medicare coverage for assistive devices like that. Um, Obviously, probably not $900, but I have had people get some portion of that covered. The next stride, that was the component that can clip on to any device. I don't believe there's any insurance coverage for that, and that is just under $400. And then the Q1, which was that little vibratory sensor, like I said, it isn't available in the US at this time, but I did the conversion off the website, and I think it's about 900 US dollars for what they're currently selling it for. It was, I think, in the UK. So obviously really expensive. But as a physical therapist, I play with low tech options as well. So taping lines on the floor in your house. There's different like laser pointers you can get off Amazon that project a line down on the floor. That's something that I can have people train with in their home. The metronome apps are free. You know, Spotify, up-tempo music. So that's I don't want you to think that your only option to tackle freezing of gait is with a $1,000 piece of equipment. Um, but you know, they're definitely out there. The other question I got was about research. Do I know of any research trials underway where people could have access to some of this equipment without purchasing it? The main trials that I saw in the US looking at the vibro tactile feedback were with the gloves at Stanford and OHSU. Interestingly, I was reading through one of the OHSU study descriptions online at clinicaltrials.gov, and it did show a freezing of gait outcome measure. So again, I don't know how directly, like those gloves can be used to reduce tremor. I don't know how directly they're using the vibration through those gloves to address walking, but that was one that I found. The Q1, the only study I found was actually out of the UK, but definitely keeping an eye out on clinicaltrials.gov for any of those in the works. I think that was all of the questions. I think that was most of the questions I received online. So, what I would challenge you with today, you know, after week one, we told you to go home and practice that weight shifting, practice it in place, practice weaving through a cone, and practice walking between two chairs. So, standing up from a chair, shifting your weight, walking, turning with a weight shift, sitting down, standing up, walking, turning with a weight shift, sitting down, just going back and forth between those two chairs. Today, I would say for the next week, play around with some cueing strategies. So try downloading a free metronome app. Um, try doing that exercise with the figure eights. Try putting music on in the background and see if you find any of that to be effective. You can tape some lines down, put some canes down on the floor for you to step over. But just try to see if doing that same exercise, you feel any more effective having some of those visual cues or auditory cues. But until then, like I said, next week, Nate's going to really dive into cognition. How does cognition affect freezing? How do we train with we call it cognitive dual tasking. And then week 4, really pull it all together and apply it to some real world scenarios. So, again, don't hesitate to reach out with questions. But until then, thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week.